So in the past few patches, the game has been leading towards this break meta. With Firefly, Boothill, and now Rappa, we now have the holy trinity of DPS that specialize in break. So now's a pretty good time to cover how exactly does the break damage work. Rather, how does the formula work? I'll obviously go over the break damage formula, but also Super Rate, which has also burst onto the scene recently with Harmony Trailblazer mostly. This is the break damage formula, for both the initial hit and the damage from the dot resulting from it. It doesn't look that daunting, especially when you compare it to the general damage formula I covered the other time, but the base damage multiplier is an equation in itself, so when you expand it, it looks something like this. All breaks immediately delay the enemy's action by 25%, and additional effects will be specified later. Let's start off with by far the most complicated element in the equation, which is the base damage. The base damage is a level multiplier, multiplied by a max toughness multiplier, multiplied by what I'll call an element multiplier. That last one isn't on the wiki, but it'll make things easier to understand, so that's why I phrased it that way. And I'll start with that. The element multiplier, well, it varies by element. This is just a fixed 2 for physical and fire, 1.5 for wind, 1 for ice and lightning, and 0.5 for quantum and imaginary. Next is the level multiplier. This is a fixed number that scales with the character's level. If an enemy causes break, it uses their level. So if you specifically implant the Swarm True-Sting boss with a wind weakness, then you kill a small bug and it happens to break, then it would use the enemy level, which is probably 95. For reference, these are the values for level 80, 89, and 95 shown on screen. Lastly, for base damage is the max toughness multiplier. This is 0.5 plus the max toughness of the enemy all over 40. For reference, one basic attack is almost always 10. Most elites have about 100, usually a little over. The recent Apocalyptic Shadow Kafka had 300. Next is Break Effect, which I don't think I need to explain this. It's literally just 1 plus the Break Effect stat that you have on your character converted to a whole number. So basically, like say my 200% Break Effect Firefly, this is 1 plus 2 converted from 200% into 2 equals to 3 times everything else. Next up are 3 of the generic enemy multipliers. I went over these 3 in my damage formula video, but I'll repeat it to spare you from the even worse audio quality of that video. For the defense multiplier, just know that the defense reduction on enemies and ignore on characters stack up additively. Defense reduction does more the more you have until it reaches 100%, in which case it does nothing since defense can't go negative in this game. One last thing to note is that your character level is in this equation. This means that unless you have 100% worth of def reduction and ignore with 100% uptime, you should always level your characters to 80. And even then, the level multiplier was earlier in the break equation, so, level them to 80. Common sources for def reduction are Pella Alt and Resolution Light Cone. Res is a stat completely different from defense. Every enemy has varied res for each element. Most enemies have 20% res to all elements they aren't weak to, 0% to those that they are, and sometimes they have a 40% or 60% res to other elements. Unlike defense, this also goes from negative 100% to 90%. So this can go below 0%. This is the main reason why even if the enemy isn't already broken, attacks against an enemy with that weakness feel like they do more damage because it's at 0% res as opposed to like 20% res or something. So at minus 100% res, your attack will do double the damage that it would at 0%. So this is pretty important. Quote-unquote common sources of this are Remnant Alt's 25% all-type res pen for the whole team, and Silverwolf 20% res shred for the implanted element on her skill. Vulnerability works identically to damage boost. There is literally only one source of elemental vulnerability though, which is Himiko's technique, which inflicts 10% fire vulnerability to all enemies for 2 turns. Otherwise, we're looking at either just break vulnerability, which comes from mainly Firefly's ult and Gallagher's talent, or universal vulnerability, which comes from Guinaifen and Jiao Qiu's technique. Himiko's technique and the other sources also just stack up additively, like similar to damage boost. Well, the broken multiplier is 0.9 for the initial hit, since the enemy isn't broken when you break it, obviously. That's the initial hit, but all elements trigger a debuff on the enemy corresponding to the element, all with their own base damage formula. These all have 150% base chance to trigger, which can be resisted or increased with effect hit rate. Physical inflicts bleed, which does damage equal to 16% of a normal enemy's max health, or 7% of an elite or boss's max health, but it cannot exceed the initial break base damage. This counts as dot and lasts for 2 turns. Fire inflicts burn, which is just 1 times the level multiplier from earlier. This does count as dot and lasts for 2 turns, that's it. Ice inflicts freeze. It immobilizes the enemy for 1 turn and does 1 times the level multiplier at the start of the opponent's turn. However, it also advances the enemy's next action by 50%. This does not count as dot and only lasts for 1 turn. Lightning inflicts shock. This is just 2 times the level multiplier. That's it. It counts as dot and lasts for 2 turns. Wind inflicts wind shear. Wind shear is unique in being able to stack. It can stack up to 5 times, with 1 stack being applied when breaking normal enemies and 3 stacks for elites and bosses. The multiplier itself is 1 times the number of stacks times the level multiplier. I think at this point you can see the common factor here. Now Quantum and Imaginary are even more anomalous. Let's start with Quantum, which applies Entanglement. First off, it additionally delays the enemy action by 20% times 1 plus your break effect. So if you have 170% break effect, it would delay the enemy action by 20% times 270%, which is 54%. This is on top of the default 25% as a reminder, so a total of 79% delay. But that's not all. At the start of the enemy's next turn, they take damage equal to 0.6 times the stat count times the level multiplier times the max toughness multiplier again. Entanglement can also stack up to 5 times, and the enemy gains a stack for every time that they're attacked while entangled. This only lasts for 1 turn and does not count as dot. Imaginary simply reduces the enemy's speed by 10%, and delays their action by a further 30%, times 1 plus the break effect. So say a Harmony Trailblazer with 220% break effect would delay the enemy action by the base 25%, plus 30% times 320%, for a total of 121% action delay. This also lasts for just 1 turn, and obviously it does not count as dot since there's literally no damage in this. Super Break was a mechanic that was introduced in 2.3 with Harmony Trailblazer's release. I briefly touched upon this in my Harmony Trailblazer PowerPoint that you should go watch, by the way, and it basically converts excess toughness damage to enemies that are already broken into even more damage. Here's the formula. As you can see, there are quite a few repeating variables. In fact, there are only 2 new variables, which is the Toughness Reduction multiplier and the Super Break damage increase. Starting with the Toughness Reduction multiplier, this is just the Toughness Reduction divided by 10, so in the case of an E6 Harmony Trailblazer with all traces unlocked, a single skill does a total of 4 toughness, so that's 4 times everything else. Next is the Super Break damage increase. Currently, there's also only 1 trace that does this, which is Harmony Trailblazer's A2 trace, which gives an extra damage bonus that's multiplied with everything else, which increases as the number of enemies decreases. Now I want to touch upon a few other key aspects of Super Break. Super Break damage usually has an inherent multiplier in front of it. For example, Firefly's Super Break only has a 35% or 50% multiplier if she has at least 200% or 350% break effect respectively. Rambo's Super Breaks only have a 60% multiplier. If you can't do basic inference, this multiplier is just one more variable that's multiplied with everything else. Also, you aren't limited to just one instance of Super Break. You can just stack multiple instances of Super Break. So if I have Harmony Trailblazer's ult up, which gives the whole team 100% Super Break when hitting weakness broken enemies, and use Firefly's skill with over 350% break effect, there's Harmony Trailblazer's 100% Super Break and Firefly's own 50% Super Break, which are calculated completely separately and both dealt at the same time. Super Break also always takes the elements of the attack that triggers it, regardless of the instance where it comes from. To put it in terms that normal human beings can understand, if I use Harmony Trailblazer's ult and use Firefly's skill on a weakness broken enemy, despite Harmony Trailblazer being an imaginary character, that instance of Super Break damage will still deal fire damage. This matters mostly for res. And the very last thing is that in the Super Break formula, the base damage variable is conspicuously missing. This means that imaginary Super Break does just as much damage as fire Super Break, assuming everything else remains constant, of course. This is part of what makes Harmony Trailblazer so potent. Alright, that's finally all. Didn't expect this to be longer than that daunting damage formula, but here we are. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, do like and subscribe. Alright, bye.